Wana. We have been boldly exploring the ethos behind what a contributive citizen is, who a contributive citizen should be, and how we can all collectively engage in shared responsibilities. Join us today as we delve into the levers, connectors, triggers, and become aware in catalyzing towards contributive citizenship. This is the Contributive Citizenship Podcast. Hello, Mpo. How are you?
I'm good, Cynthia. How are you doing
We're
today?
doing a marathon sprint today, but we're almost there. You shared so generously earlier about what a contributive citizen is and its active participation in the lives of individuals and societies. It looks like volunteering, it looks like advocating for social change and engaging in civic activities. As a crucial ethos, it strengthens our communities, promotes social cohesion, and fosters a sense of belonging. And even so, in South Africa, we see at a practical level citizens mobilizing over various causes, be it the pandemic, human rights, inclusion. But how important is that educational aspect, civic education, knowing the Constitution, knowing your rights, in fostering a culture of contributive citizenship?
So I think if you remember earlier, we spoke about the 7 functions of culture following Mazurui's, but perhaps we could anchor this podcast in terms of what are the key triggers, connectors, and pressure points that either become catalysts for contributive citizenship or become challenges for contributive citizenship. I think the first one I see as a catalyst, spontaneous catalyst, I would say, would be good causes. So where a contributive citizen may be passionate about a certain good cause, and you start a cause-related campaign, and that triggers an opportunity for commerce to then sponsor what we've known as cause-related marketing. So there are many case studies here. The most written about case study is a case study of Reebok and Nike, where a cause like Amnesty International were celebrating a milestone anniversary. And in doing so, they realized they didn't have enough money to run their campaign. And they went and approached these 2 manufacturers. And they found that although at that time, under Phil Knight, Nike was keen to support, they were seen as having questionable practices in terms of how their shoes were manufactured. And they found that Reebok at the time, firstly, was a brand that resonated with the the hippie activists of Woodstock and the movements of the time. So it was seen as an activist sneaker shoe. And as they went in there, they found executives that seemed attuned to the message of Amnesty International, and therefore they made money available and got seen over the years as a progressive brand relative to Nike. Of course, Nike has over the years shed off that negative branding, and now they are one of the premier brands. So that's a classical example. Other examples would be where you find, so I think, for instance, the mobile companies have an opportunity to look for a voice of cause-related marketing among the 17 SDGs and find one through which they can plow back. I know all of them support education in terms of SDG 4. They support, for instance, call centers that deal with emergency services. But perhaps that's not highly visible to Joe and Sally public, and maybe they need to figure out how else to find a voice. And maybe citizens also need to find a way of triggering them to find a voice of cause-related marketing. When you watch pay TV, there's a few brands there that seem to have found, largely through CSI, how to do CSI projects that strengthen the brand. But it requires a yin-yang of citizens that also have certain causes that they wish to champion, and they need the support of a commercial muscle to fund those causes. Secondly, you mentioned pandemics, disasters, war, famine, pandemics are a negative trigger for positive contributive citizenship. We saw it with the COVID-19 pandemic, the biggest pandemic we've experienced in history. And so there were those that, sadly, in the contributive versus extractive, that abused the situation. We know of scandals of masks, tenders that went haywire. We know of tenders on sanitizers that went haywire, but we also probably didn't hear enough about good causes that people may have put together to support. We probably underestimate good causes like even the smart watches that we're wearing, where the manufacturers made sure you could read your oxygen levels through your watch, through a phone app, and through this and the other. There are many people who invented apps for symptomatic diagnostics, where they said if you answer the following questions, you show the same following exhibit the following symptoms, you've got a fever, go consult, test for COVID. Whoever helped government departments across the world to let your phone, using its GSM and other digital footprints, to tell you whether you've been in a COVID zone recently and triggering you to go and test. All those and many others that we probably cannot mention right now are examples of how a pandemic like that triggered innovative thinking. And then perhaps the biggest of them all is the work from home trend. Until COVID, people didn't know of Zoom, Teams. I always say someone should write a book called You're on Mute, because again, that's an expression that became quite common. Even today, we still have to remind people you're on mute.
Unmute.
And so technology has gone quite a long way to respond to disasters and a pandemic such as that, to help innovators contribute meaningfully. Then there are times when we respond to natural caused disasters like floods, which trigger sometimes homelessness, dislocation, disposition. And so there are always people, social activists, social engineers these days, as they're called also, that emerge with solutions that help trigger positive contributive citizenship. Gift of the Givers is such an example, which has become globally. In fact, it's another thing that South Africa perhaps exported to the world, where it is highly trusted to come into disaster areas, deliver medical care, deliver resources, without being seen to be biased to various areas. Then lastly, I'll say poor government policy or good government policy can also be a trigger. Sadly, there are still people whose children live with especially people whose mothers were pregnant when they suffered listeriosis. But there are healthcare practitioners that have come to the rescue with innovative solutions, inoculations, and other things that help children cope better with those health challenges. If you look at medical conditions like polio, you can almost cut back to a certain age or year in the 70s where people stopped having polio because of innovations in medicine. If you look at, for instance, diabetes, a happy accident where a scientist in the lab was testing the mold that gave us insulin and forgot it overnight. And when they came into the lab rebuking themselves for the mistake, when they tested it on the rat, found out actually that's what was needed. You just needed to the process to unfold, let it be a mold form, and then voila, you've got insulin, which is now helping a lot of people living with type 1, type 2 diabetes. So science, technology, innovation, social and otherwise, are means through which contributive citizens can respond to disasters, to challenges, to help solve imminent and real issues that affect society.
A lot of the population, and I'll zone it on South Africa, sometimes feels a lot of apathy and discomfort when it comes to science and innovation, almost feeling like Big Brother is looking over them. I wonder if we look at some of the pressure points that are linked to contributive citizenship, would you attribute, this over surveillance as a pressure point? Or in your view, what would be some of the pressure points linked to contributive citizens?
I think at a personal level, self-doubt is the first, or low self-esteem or lack of self-confidence. Secondly, a lack of tenacity. Look recently at that doctor who invented a mechanism using stem cells to cure hearing. So now people born unable to hear can hear because there's an operation that he's made a breakthrough to change the eardrum so that people can hear. There's the world-renowned heart transplant, Chris Barnard, which has controversies because of the apartheid era that the black people that were in that surgical room were not acknowledged. One or two have been acknowledged over time. So again, those are examples of how healthcare came to the rescue and made a contribution to the heart transplant solutions. So
This is the Contributive Citizenship podcast, and we're in conversation with Mpho Makwana. South Africa is said to have one of the best constitutions in the world, a diverse culture, governance, and accountability, yet we're the most unequal society in the world. In looking at contributive citizenship, Ntate Makwana, what role do you believe governments play in encouraging or inhibiting contributive citizenship amongst their citizens, and how can governments balance the need for regulation and the need for civic empowerment?
So the average person who wants to be a contributive citizen in this sphere of constitutional democracy and human rights must firstly have a sense of patience with self and patience with society, in my view. If we look at, for instance, the whole notion of democracy, it goes back to the year 1200. The Magna Carta is one of the instruments that symbolizes the first semblance of a constitutional document. And if you look at where it developed between Rome, which now is the state of Italy, and Athens, which is where democracy is seen to have matured. And then the word democracy comes from Greek vocabulary. You have to say to yourself, let's look at our constitution relative to other countries' constitutions. And maybe the oldest constitutional democracy could be seen as the US, with more than 200 plus of documented constitutional history. The Greek gave us democracy in the 1200s or prior, but the documentation thereof took a while. And therefore, we should be saying Athens is the oldest democracy in the world, but actually the US bypassed them because for 200 something years, one amendment after another were thoroughly documented. There was a library and so on. Our democracy, out of that example of 200 and something years old, is merely 30 something years in play. And therefore, we have had since 1994, 30 years of democracy, but actually our actual constitution will only reach 30 in 2026 because it was published in May 96 thereabout. And so we need to understand that it's an evolution. For it, even in that instance of the, we're said to have Roman Dutch law, even if you look at the Magna Carta in terms of Roman law and how some of that is embedded in our system, each of the countries elsewhere in the world that have mature democracies have evolved over centuries. And so we need to firstly have that. Secondly, beyond patience, we need to constantly be asking ourselves, how do we make sure that the education system incorporates knowledge of human rights and knowledge of how human rights systems work? I've always argued over the years relative to this that I think the challenge with democracy, because people will often say, yeah, let's look at Singapore and other countries like those. The difference is that many countries post-democracy that are seen to be thriving are those that had benevolent dictators. So post one system of oppression, they had a benevolent dictator who said, this is the marching line, this is where, and this is the only direction we're going. And therefore, the sense of homogeneity, of convergence happened and was orchestrated. In our case, from day one, we said, we are different. Later, we adopted a code of arms that says Ike, Clara, Ike, united in our diversity. We flagged and celebrated the diversity more than the inclusion or the commonality. As a result, everybody articulated their sense of being and their rights based on I'm different. And so finding convergence is difficult. On top of that, you top it up with that we've got 13 official languages. We've got 11, plus now the 12th one is sign language and others. And so the various official languages means that everybody wants to find self-expression in each of their channel of language. Even though we use English commonly, but the different vernacular platforms perpetuates a divergence rather than a convergence. If you ask the average South African, what is our shared national values, I bet you won't get a common answer. And yet they are there enshrined in the Constitution. We value freedom, we value equality, we value human dignity, and freedom for all. And so if you look at those four sets of values, they are meant to be the unifier. Regardless of what political party you belong to, we should be saying our common ground is the four values.
Yes.
But it's not happening because we don't talk enough about what brings us. I mean, I always watch the speeches on Heritage Day, on Human Rights Day, because these are the days when we should be elevating those values. We don't speak enough of them.
But aren't we too hard on our state in Tatemakwane? Is it too much for them to be the unifying force in as far as making sure that we know the values and attribute them to us, even in our diversity? Is there no space for avenue to yes, talk about contributive citizenship, but also let them off the leash a little bit, just to say, here we are, let's have our own responsibility and drive the conversation around what the values are for ourselves. Yes, they're enshrined in the Constitution, but what is our impetus in making sure that we enforce them?
There's an expression, I may not say it correct verbatim, but it goes along the lines of unto whom responsibility is bestowed, much is expected. The reason the governing party takes so much criticism is because if you go back to the anti-apartheid movement, they told us they were the vanguard. They were the movement that will deliver this new society. They even themselves call themselves the leader of society. And so my definition of a leader is someone you choose to follow to a place that you wouldn't go by yourself. So they've led us effectively to a point. And when you are in incumbency for too long, you start suffering what people call sins of incumbency. And maybe the incumbency and the leadership did not refresh quick enough to make sure that you don't have a leadership and a sense of incumbency that looks too much into the rear mirror as opposed to looking ahead. They do look ahead. There's NDB 2030, there's many others, but half the time when pressed against the wall, what is the scripted response?
We gave you freedom.
We're undoing the legacy of apartheid.
Yeah.
And so when you constantly, I mean, that's a very sore point and it's a noble thing, but at some point we have to rise above that legacy and now start saying we're quantum leaping you into this direction. Then we have flaws as human beings. Back to the competition of contributive citizenship versus extractive citizenship. Unfortunately, most people started joining those parties that give you political power for the wrong reasons. Some join them because if you're in the inner circle, then you've got closer proximity to tenderpreneurship. And perhaps tenderpreneurship in itself has some ills that perpetuated the circumstances we find ourselves in today as a country. And so if you are my source, my feeding source, and you are in power, it means that every time I have this cup of coffee, I have to figure out firstly what is your share of my cup of coffee before I can consume my cup of coffee. And that value chain of patronage has triggered a lot of undesirable behaviors, which we later defined as state capture. But really, it is not uniquely South African. Look at a country like Italy. It's an unfair comparison, but let's look at it. They make a lot of interesting brands that people love. Fashion,
Cars.
from Milan, luxury cars, coffee was popularized by Italians, even though it's not originally from Italy, and wine and many other things. But I mean, the Italian political system is infested with mafiosos. And maybe it's a society who must check, how does it produce these brands that the world wants? And yet somewhere embedded, the things we consume inspired by that culture, pizza and whatnot, are made by family businesses that often are riddled with mafia tendencies. Let's look at countries where our country's got lots of fresh avos. But in South Africa, we don't call avos guacamole. And so every time you go to a shop and they tell you this is guacamole, it means it's something made with avos from Mexico and parts of Latin America. Those countries are infested with cartelism. So I think the myopia we suffered, sound of at the risk of repeating myself, is that often when we deal with these ills of sins of incumbency and the ills of the negatives in our society, we tend to think that we're the only ones. Perhaps if we had someone pause and say, what are the things we can learn from other economies dealing with similar problems, and appreciate that we're dealing with a global system. I mean, kleptocracy in its oldest form is found in this very oldest democracy called America. Oil, pharmaceutical, tobacco, guns, all those have got powerful kleptocrats behind that. They call it lobbying. They go lobby government to pass laws that favor their power. And so that is a form of state capture. Certainly, it is not a fluke that someone like Elon Musk contributes hundreds of billions of dollars to a campaign for a president. Surely it's not just sheer benevolence. There must be something in return for those billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. So the key thing for the average South African is to, as you say, maybe let's stop beating ourselves up. Let's always package what works well. You know, in strategy, we always say, let's do a stop, start, continue. So let's package those things that we should stop doing as individual citizens, stop doing as leaders, citizens in leadership in government, stop doing as leaders in business. Some leaders in business say BE is not working because now they've benefited from it. And so let's find how we stop those things. Let's find things that we need to continue doing because they're working well and they're doing well. I mean, you know, we must attribute credit where it's due. In the first 5 years of democracy, a lot of good foundations were laid by the cabinet under the leadership of President Mandela. The years that followed under very able leaders, and here I would want to pay tribute to one of my perhaps economic role models, the late Governor Tito Mboweni, in terms of the role, together with a collective of other economists in the liberation movement that laid the foundation of the economic system we see today. They started out in 1992 with the Montfleur scenarios, and then year after year, when government went into office, they published things like the Skoody's Nice and Skodonk scenarios in the office of the president, and then the Dunugeng scenarios. Now we've got the Indlamiti scenarios. Under the government of the day, between the period of 1999 building up towards 2004, the economy doubled in size. Things were going well. Of course, then we went down a slippery slope in the 9 years of state capture. And now we're trying to recover from two problems in South Africa. We're trying to recover from those 9 sort of wasted years, okay, regardless of who's to blame, but we've lost 9 years of economic growth. Our economy hasn't grown in double digits since then, or even in single substantive digits. And secondly, it will sound like a lame excuse, but we mustn't underestimate the disruption that was caused by the pandemic of COVID-19, not only South Africa, but to many economies in the world. Even today, you walk around malls of this nature, you find a shop today, tomorrow that place of trade is covered in paper, and there's a big sign saying space for rent, because the economy has gotten tougher, not just locally, but globally. And so we need to constantly be learning and reinventing and refreshing our approaches.
I'd like us to talk about connectors and how they link to contributive citizenship. I see them as social relationships that connect us to each other, provide us with a sense of belonging. We see how strong social network can also motivate us to engage in civic activities. And I know a topic that you're very passionate about, rather, is intergenerational responsibility. How can older generations share their knowledge and experience with younger generations to foster a culture of civic engagement? And what role do families play in instilling values of contributive citizenship in children? You touched on it earlier, but perhaps to make it a bit more granular, what actual conversations should be taking place in the home and in between generations?
It's taboo in African culture to be seen to be putting yourself on a pedestal. Yet, it is very crucial now for those of my generation of Gen Xers, those that came before us as baby boomers, that somehow managed to make sense of life and achieved certain things, be it in the various spheres of life, as doctors, as specialists, as business people, and so on. As people publish their biographies, as we've seen a few people do so with a lens of contribution in the sense of engage. How many people of my generation do podcasts? How many people older generation do podcasts? Town hall meetings are the simplest form of podcasting. I admire many of them. I'll cite a role model in the form of Dr. Ruel Khoza, who is a very humble, low-key person. But one thing I wish to emulate, perhaps if I could use this word, in him, is what he did for his home village. As things became prosperous for him, in whatever sense of diligence that he achieved, he went back to his home village and built an entire school. Because from his platform of contribution, he thought that's the biggest plowback he could give. There are many people that have gone back to their home villages and built hospitals. There are many that have done other things. not for anything in return,
Mm.
but purely from a contribution point of view. And so in his language of Setsonga, they say Mentiro ya Bulabula, and he actually, with his brother, published a recording called Mentiro ya Bulabula. So if we borrow from the Tsonga language that Mentiro ya Bulabula, actions speak louder than words, let's all find a program of action through which we contribute, through which we give back, and through which we, as we used to chant in the Black Management Forum, we lift as we rise. If only 2, 3, 5% of leaders in South Africa did that, they say for everything you do, if you touch 1,000 people, it multiplies 5 to 10-fold. So if the successful, because in any society, in any event, the people who pierce through the ceiling never make up more than 3% of society. It's just like that. So if the 3% that have really achieved meaningfully, given where we've come from platform of disadvantage, I don't know what their total number is. We used to have a project that I hope to resuscitate through this work. The Financial Mail used to have a thing called the Black Book. Maybe one needs to include in this a platform where you celebrate a platform of contributive leaders. And maybe that's a task for our next series of podcasts, where we showcase people who are doing meaningful contributions for the better advancement of the next generation, for passing the baton to the next generation. I've seen a lot of people publish books purely for vanity's case. And so you get to be seen on front pages of social magazines, sipping champagnes and so on. And then what? So let's find avenues of contribution. Let's find avenues of systematic plowback so that next generations then can, in their own choices of their own field of contribution, have a series of batons to pick up. So if someone tomorrow chooses, like I did, to use leadership as a platform of contribution, whatever I shall have left behind under the theme of contributive citizenship, hopefully they'll pick up the baton and take it forward to a higher level. If, like the medical doctors I've mentioned, they do the same, someone should pick it up. I have 2 cousins, one a cousin brother by Western tradition, one a cousin, that are in the sphere of ophthalmology together with their significant others. One of them has built a hospital, an eye hospital, which is a great accomplishment out in the Pretoria West, next to where I was born in Lady Selborne. There's an eye hospital called Mbudule. And there's one here in Sandton called Grayston Eye Center or Grayston Eye Care. He will chastise me for mispronouncing his eye center. They had built another hospital together with other partners between them. When you drive out into Protea, along the N12, where you pass the Sasol garages, there's a thing called Soweto Advanced Healthcare System. So all those are examples of people who say, I come from a certain background. So both of them, one, Dr. Lohodi, who's built the Mbudule, is a son of a teacher and a social worker and has become this world-renowned ophthalmologist. He, at some point, was even president of the World Ophthalmological Society. And the other is a son of a preacher and a teacher, Philip Patudi and his wife Precious, both of them ophthalmologists. And here they are, they've come and decided this is their area of contribution, making our retinas fit for purpose, as it were, for the future.
Yeah.
So there are many of these examples that we can find. I'm just citing these 2 that are close to home for me as various spheres. So either their children will become ophthalmologists, I don't know. But someone in the family will be inspired by their good example and take it to the next level.
And also have a reference point that is within the family that they can point to and also workshop. But Mpho, in examining contributive citizenship, you've been more than generous. You've compelled us to actively reflect on our actions, our choices, and our commitments in ensuring that we are all aligned to the mission of fostering a more sustainable world, but also active and not extractive citizens. But looking ahead at the future of contributive citizenship, how will emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, biotechnology impact the concept of contributive citizenship? And what new forms of civic engagement can you think of that may emerge in future?
Well, I think you've just put your finger on it. Firstly, it requires every individual to move with the mantra that my past and my current circumstances do not determine my future. So if we start looking at parting shots, the first parting shot is really that every person must know that they are here on earth for a reason, and they must find that reason and unleash it positively. Secondly, as you know, my daughter's doing her research paper for her honors in mental health, and she's chosen this realm of artificial intelligence to focus her research on. So the other day she sent me her draft and said, Papa, can you look at this and tell me what I've missed? So out of my curiosity, I then searched on one of the platforms I used, how many artificial intelligence platforms are there that are applied in higher education? And turned out that there's about 50. So I wrote back to her with a list and said, have you looked at the pros and cons of each of these? So she says, what? I said, yeah, actually, relative to the 10 you've looked at, there's actually 40 more.
Sure.
So I'm hoping, firstly, we can see a artificial intelligence platform on how to embrace and work with the SDGs. So that if I'm a contributive citizen, there's an easy go-to place, because what artificial intelligence is good at is aggregating information and knowledge and helping society to find, discover new knowledge, new information, or new references. The fear, though, is that artificial intelligence could make us lazy, because it mustn't start taking away from empirical evidence. It mustn't start taking away from experiential experience. Because the human brain works on two things mostly. The adult learning process, where you learn through discovery, and also experiential, where you learn through applying your human senses. So there must be certain things that you see and observe, that's experiential. There must be certain things you hear. There must be certain things that you see or experience being spoken. In terms of feelings, there must be certain things that you feel and their impact on your emotions. Learning is wholesome if it leverages the 5 senses of human beings. So, but I'm hoping that soon someone somewhere between me and inspiring people to be contributive, someone publishes an artificial intelligence platform on how to learn and embrace sustainability.
Mpho, thank you. You've shared generously with us on today's episode. Your perspectives on embodying a contributive citizenship is unmatched. You've been kind enough to also lend us into your personal life and some of the triggers and the provocations that have made you who you are today. And overall, as a contributing citizen of South Africa, you always leave me inspired and motivated to look ahead. So, ke leboha ntate for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for taking this journey with me.
It's been an incredible journey exploring the ideas of Mpho Makwana and his concept of contributive citizenship. He's encouraged us to take an active role in society to become the change that we want to see. Thank you for listening throughout the series, and here's to making tangible actions in our lifetimes. Thank you. Brought to you and authorized by Mpho Makwana. That's
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.